The morning I changed the locks on my own cottage, I was not angry. I was not shaking. I was not crying. I was standing there in the cold Muskoka air, watching the sun come up over the water, and I felt something I had not felt in almost 7 years. I felt like myself again. My daughter-in-law had spent 3 weeks telling her parents they could move into my property, not asking me, telling them. And my son, the boy I had raised and loved and given every good thing I had, stood right beside her and said nothing. They had already picked out the bedroom. They had already told her mother which closet would be hers. They had already started talking about how nice it would be to have family nearby. Nobody asked James. Nobody told James. James was just supposed to smile and hand over the keys. But here is what they forgot. The cottage was in my name. The deed had my signature on it. And after 7 years of watching myself get slowly erased from my own family, I had finally started paying attention to every piece of paper that mattered. What happened next destroyed what was left of their plan and changed every relationship in my life. And I need you to hear the whole story, because the beginning of it is going to make you angry, and the end of it is going to feel like the first deep breath after a very long time underwater. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something real. Think about the people closest to you right now. Think about whether any of them have ever made a decision that affected your life without asking you first. Think about whether you stayed quiet because you loved them or because you were afraid of what would happen if you spoke up. If you have ever swallowed something that should have been said out loud, stay with me. Because this story is about the moment I stopped swallowing. Leave me a comment telling me what you would have done. And tell me at what point you would have finally stopped being patient. My name is James. I am 61 years old. I built a life that looked from the outside like something to be proud of. A successful business. A home that was paid off. A cottage on a lake in Muskoka that I had bought with money I earned and saved over 2 decades. A son named Derek who I loved more than I ever found the words to say. And for a long time, I thought all of that was enough. I thought the love I gave would come back to me in some form. I thought the patience I showed would eventually be recognized. I was wrong about all of it, but it took me 7 years to understand just how wrong I was. Derek met Vanessa when he was 32. She was smart, confident, and organized in a way that I admired at first. She knew what she wanted. She moved fast. Within 8 months, they were engaged. Within 14 months, they were married. I paid for a large portion of the wedding because Derek asked me to and because I wanted to. I did not ask for thanks. I did not keep score. That was not who I was back then. The first sign came at the wedding itself. I was seated at a table with people I had never met, not at the family table, not near the front. I was placed in the middle of the room between Vanessa's father's business contacts. I told myself it was a seating mix-up. I told myself these things happen at big events. I smiled through the entire reception and gave a toast that made people laugh and cry. Derek hugged me at the end of the night and said thank you, and I decided that was enough. It was not enough, but I would not understand that for a long time. In the first year of their marriage, I noticed that family dinners started happening at Vanessa's parents' house instead of mine. This was not a problem on its own. Her parents, Frank and Carol, were warm enough people when things were going well. But I noticed that I was invited less and less often. When I asked Derek about it, he said the drive to my place was long. I lived 40 minutes away. I said nothing more. The cottage was where I still felt at home. I had bought it 14 years before Derek married Vanessa. It was on a small private lake about 2.5 hours north of the city. 3 bedrooms, a large wraparound deck, a boathouse, and more quiet than I had found anywhere else in my life. After my wife Margaret passed away 8 years ago, the cottage became the place I went to find my footing again. It was mine in every way a place can be yours. Emotionally, legally, completely. Derek and Vanessa used the cottage often in the summers. I welcomed that. I wanted them there. I thought it kept us connected. What I did not see was that each time they came up, they came with a slightly different attitude about the place. Small comments started appearing. Vanessa mentioned once that the kitchen needed updating. She mentioned another time that the guest room mattress was old. She told Derek in front of me that the dock needed to be replaced. I made some of those changes. I replaced the mattress. I updated some of the kitchen. Appliances, I had the dock inspected and repaired. I told myself I was being a good host. What I was actually doing was responding to a slow training process I had not yet recognized. The second year of their marriage brought the first real conflict. Derek called me in February to say that he and Vanessa had decided to spend the entire month of August at the cottage. Not a weekend, not 2 weeks, the entire month. He said Vanessa needed a break and that she had always loved it up there. I had already planned a trip that August with 2 old friends, a fishing trip we had been talking about for years. I told Derek this and he went quiet. Then he said he would talk to Vanessa. 3 days later, he called back and said maybe I could move my trip to September. My trip that I had planned, to a place I owned. I moved the trip to September. I told myself family came first. I told myself it was just 1 month. But something sat wrong inside me after that call, and I could not shake it. By year 3, Vanessa had begun referring to the cottage as our place when speaking with her friends. I heard this on a phone call she did not know I was close enough to hear. I did not say anything. I started paying closer attention. Year 4 is when Frank and Carol first came to stay at the cottage. Derek invited them without telling me in advance. I arrived on a Friday evening to find Vanessa's parents already there, already settled into the master bedroom, which was my room. I slept in the smaller guest room that weekend. Frank grilled steaks on my deck and Carol rearranged items in my kitchen cabinets. They were perfectly pleasant. They called me Jim, which I have never gone by. When I left Sunday evening, Carol told me it had been lovely and that she hoped we could make this a regular thing. I drove home with a feeling I could not name. It was not quite anger. It was not quite sadness. It was something closer to the slow understanding that the edges of my life were being moved without my permission. Year 5 was when everything accelerated. Vanessa became pregnant. I was genuinely happy about this. I was going to be a grandfather. Derek called me with the news, and I could hear real joy in his voice, and I matched it completely. But almost immediately after the announcement, I noticed a shift in how decisions were being made. Vanessa's parents were suddenly central to every conversation. Frank and Carol were consulted about the nursery color. Frank and Carol were at every doctor's appointment. Frank and Carol were at the house when I arrived for dinners that I had not been told were happening. I tried to be present without being intrusive. I offered to help. I offered money when they needed it. When the baby was born, a girl they named Sophie, I was called to the hospital 3 hours after Frank and Carol had already been there. When I arrived, Carol was holding Sophie and Frank had his arm around Derek, and Vanessa was asleep, and I stood in the doorway of that hospital room and understood something I had been avoiding for years. I was the outside family. In my own son's life, I had become the secondary person. I held Sophie for 11 minutes. I counted. Carol asked if I could pass the baby back because Sophie seemed more comfortable with her. I handed my granddaughter to another woman and went home and sat in the dark for a long time. I did not tell anyone how I felt. I kept showing up. I kept being generous. The cottage stayed open. My wallet stayed open. My door stayed open. I thought that if I kept giving, eventually I would be seen. But the giving had a different effect than I expected. When you keep giving without requiring anything in return, some people do not feel grateful. Some people feel confirmed. They feel confirmed that your giving is simply what you do, that your resources are simply there to be used, and that your silence about your own needs means you have none. I became, in the quiet arithmetic of that family, a resource. Not a father, not a grandfather, a resource. The moment that finally cracked something open in me came in the spring of year 6. I had been up at the cottage alone for a long weekend, doing some maintenance, clearing the dock, just being in the quiet I loved. I came back to find a voicemail from Vanessa. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was. She said that she and Derek had decided that Frank and Carol needed more space because Carol's knees were getting worse and their apartment stairs were becoming difficult. She said the cottage would be a perfect solution for the summers and that she had already told her parents they could spend June, July, and August there starting that year. She left this message on my voicemail as a statement of fact. I listened to that message 4 times, then I saved it. I called Derek. He did not answer. I called again. He picked up on the 3rd call and his voice had that careful tone it got when he already knew the conversation was going to be difficult. I asked him if he knew about the voicemail Vanessa had left me. He said he did. I asked him if he thought that was an appropriate way to handle something involving my property. He said Vanessa had just been trying to be efficient. I asked him when efficiency had replaced asking. He said I was overreacting. There it was, the word that had been waiting to arrive. Overreacting. I said I was not overreacting. I said I owned that property and any use of it required my agreement. Derek sighed. He said he had hoped I would want to help. I told him I did want to help, but that being told what would happen with my own property was not help, it was assumption. The call ended without resolution. Frank and Carol did not come that first summer. Vanessa gave me what felt like a cold shoulder for 2 months. Derek was awkward around me. I kept showing up. I kept being James, steady and patient and present. But something had changed inside me that I did not show anyone. I had started keeping records, not obsessively, not angrily, but carefully. I kept the voicemail. I started saving text messages. When Vanessa sent me a text saying they would need the cottage the last 2 weeks of August, I responded with a calm confirmation and saved a copy of the exchange. I was not sure yet why I was doing this. I only knew that something in me had grown quiet and alert, the way a person gets quiet and alert when they understand that the ground beneath them may not be as solid as it looked. Year 7 began with a change I had not expected. After a long period of reflection, I had started seeing a therapist. I want to be honest about this because it matters. Her name was Dr. Renata, and she was the first person in a long time who sat across from me and simply listened without agenda. In our sessions, I began to see the pattern of the last 6 years clearly for the first time. the slow drift toward the edges, the unthanked generosity, the voicemail, the moved trip, the hospital room, the replaced kitchen items, the wrong table at the wedding. None of these things alone was catastrophic, but together they formed a picture that was very clear once I let myself look at it. Dr. Renata did not tell me what to do. She asked me questions. One question she asked changed everything. She said, "James, if a stranger had treated you the way your family has treated you over these years, would you have kept letting them into your home?" I sat with that question for a long time. The answer, when it came, was so obvious and so painful that I had to stop the session and step outside for air. I came back in and said no. A stranger would not have been allowed to do any of this. And she said, "So the question is not whether you were treated unfairly. The question is what you want to do now that you see it clearly." I spent 3 months figuring out what I wanted to do. I consulted a lawyer. I reviewed the cottage deed, which was in my name alone as it had always been. I reviewed my will, which I had not updated since Margaret died. I made several changes to the will quietly and legally with counsel. I transferred no property. I did not need to. I simply made sure that every legal document in my life reflected my actual wishes and no one else's assumptions. I also did something that felt small but was actually enormous. I said to Derek when he called me in March that I had been thinking about our relationship and I wanted to talk about it seriously. He said, "Sure, what is on your mind?" I told him I had been feeling sidelined for several years. I told him specifically about the voicemail, about the wedding seating, about the hospital, about the summers. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse Vanessa by name, but I was not vague. I told him I needed our relationship to be different. Derek listened. Then he said he was sorry I felt that way, not sorry for what happened, sorry that I felt a way about it. There is a difference, and it matters, and he did not seem to know there was a difference. I said I understood. I said I hoped things would change. I hung up feeling clearer than I had in years, not because the conversation had gone well, but because I had finally said the true thing out loud and the response had told me exactly what I needed to know. The demand came in October. I was at the cottage for the fall color, which is the most beautiful time to be there. The maples go red and orange, and the lake goes silver, and the silence is almost perfect. I was sitting on the deck with a cup of coffee when my phone rang. It was Vanessa. She opened with a pleasantry which I noted because she rarely called me directly and rarely opened warmly. She asked how the cottage was. I said it was beautiful. Then she moved to the real reason. She said that she and Derek had been talking, and that with Carol's knees getting worse and Frank having had a minor heart procedure in the summer, which I had not been told about, they felt it was time for her parents to have a more stable arrangement. She said the cottage was sitting mostly empty for 9 months of the year and that it would be good for everyone if Frank and Carol could stay there long term, not just summers. She said they would take care of themselves and would be responsible tenants. She used the word tenants. I noted that too. I said I needed to think about it. She said she had already told her parents it was likely going to work out. I felt the familiar ground shift under that sentence. Already told them, already decided. James would adjust. I said again, slowly and clearly, that I needed to think about it and that nothing had been decided. She said, of course, but to please think quickly because her parents needed to plan. I said I would be in touch. I ended the call. I sat on that deck for 2 hours. The trees were on fire with color. The lake was still. I drank my coffee and I thought about every moment of the last 7 years, and I made a decision that I had probably been moving toward for a long time. The decision was simple. The cottage was mine. It was not available for Frank and Carol. It was not available as a solution to a problem that had been created without my input. And more than that, I was going to stop pretending that the arrangement of the last 7 years was acceptable to me. I was going to stop being the quiet man in the corner who handed over his piece so that others could be comfortable. I drove home from the cottage the next morning. I had calls to make. The first call was to my lawyer. I told him about the situation and asked him to confirm, for my own peace of mind, that no informal agreement or repeated use of property by family members could create any kind of legal claim to it. He confirmed this clearly and also noted that it would be wise to have a formal written policy about who used the property and under what conditions. We drafted a simple document that outlined that the cottage was my private residence, that any use by family or guests required my written permission in advance, and that no standing arrangement existed or would exist without a formal signed agreement. I kept this document. The second call was to Derek. He answered on the first ring, which told me Vanessa had probably already spoken to him about my non-answer. I asked him directly whether he supported the idea of his in-laws moving into my cottage. He said he thought it would help everyone. I asked him what exactly it would help for me. He paused. He said it would be nice to have family nearby for Sophie. I pointed out that Frank and Carol were not my family. They were Vanessa's family. He said I was being harsh. I said I was being accurate. I told Derek that my answer was no, that Frank and Carol would not be moving into the cottage, that the cottage was my home and my property, and that I intended to use it more, not less, as I got older. I told him that if he or Vanessa had concerns about her parents' living situation, I was sympathetic and would help think through real solutions, but that none of those solutions included my property being reassigned without my agreement. Derek said he needed to talk to Vanessa. I said that was fine. I said I wanted him to also understand something important, which was that beyond the cottage, I needed our relationship to change. I needed to be treated as a parent and not as a convenience. I told him I was not angry. I was tired. And tired, I said, is different from angry because anger fades, but tired turns into distance if nothing changes. He said he would call me back. He did not call back that day. He did not call back the next day either. Vanessa called instead. Her tone had changed. She was no longer warm. She was the version of herself I had seen occasionally over the years when she did not get what she wanted, which was efficient and cold and pointed. She said she found it hard to believe that I would refuse to help her aging parents when I had a property sitting mostly unused. I said the property was not mostly unused, it was mine, and I used it when I chose to. She said this was selfish. I said it was ownership. She said her parents had done nothing to deserve this treatment. I said no one had accused them of anything and that this was not about them as people. It was about the fact that I had not been asked, I had been told, and that was the entire problem. She said I was making this about my ego. I said I was making this about a boundary that should have been respected years ago. She said that was very convenient now that her parents actually needed help. I said I was sorry her parents were having a difficult time and that I meant that sincerely, but that sincerity did not extend to surrendering my home. She hung up on me. 20 minutes later, I received a text from Derek. It said, I cannot believe you are doing this to our family. I read it twice. Then I wrote back. I said, I have supported this family financially and emotionally for 7 years. I have been aided at the wrong table, left out of decisions, told what would happen with my property, and kept at the edge of my grandchild's life. I am not doing anything to this family. I am finally doing something for myself. If you want to talk about that seriously, I am available. I saved that exchange. He did not respond for 4 days. In those 4 days, several things happened. I received a call from Carol, which surprised me. She was tearful and apologetic and said she hoped she had not caused any trouble. I told her she had done nothing wrong and that she should not worry. She said Vanessa had been very certain things would work out. I said I understood that, and I was sorry for any confusion, but that I had never agreed to the arrangement. She said quietly that she had had a feeling that was the case. That told me something important. Carol had known, somewhere in her understanding, that the certainty Vanessa projected was not backed by my actual agreement. She had trusted her daughter's word over her own instinct. I also called my sister, Ruth, who had watched all of this from a careful distance for years. Ruth had never liked the dynamic but had said little because she did not want to interfere. I told her everything. She was not surprised. She said she had watched James disappear for years. She said she was glad I was back. That sentence, "I was glad I was back," hit me harder than I expected. I had not realized how much of me had gone quiet. How much of the James who used to have opinions and take up space and say what he thought had been slowly compressed into a version that just accommodated and absorbed. I had not lost myself all at once. I had lost myself in very small pieces, one swallowed word at a time, one moved trip at a time, one wrong table at a time. On day 4, Derek called. He had clearly been coached or had done significant thinking because his tone was different again. He was measured. He said he wanted to understand my perspective better. I was glad to hear that. We talked for almost an hour. I told him the full story of the last 7 years as clearly and calmly as I could. I told him about every specific moment I had mentioned in my text. I did not embellish. I did not catastrophize. I simply described what had happened and how I had experienced it. Derek was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then he said he had not realized how many of those things had happened. He said he had been focused on making Vanessa happy and building their life, and he had not seen what was happening with me. I told him I believed that. I told him I did not think he had been cruel deliberately. I told him that the problem with slow erosion is that the person doing the eroding often does not see the damage because each individual action seems small. He asked me what I wanted. I told him. I wanted to be invited to things, not as an afterthought. I wanted to be consulted about anything involving my property or my resources. I wanted to have a genuine relationship with Sophie, not a politely tolerated one. I wanted to be treated as a parent, which meant being seen, being asked, being included. I did not want apologies for the past, though I appreciated the ones that came. I wanted different behavior going forward. Derek said he would try. I told him trying was enough to start with, but I also told him something else. I told him that I had learned in the last several months that I could not make my well-being dependent on whether he tried or succeeded. I told him I had started building a life that was full on its own terms, and that what I was offering him was a relationship within that life, not a rescue of the parts of my life that had gone empty. He said he understood. I was not sure he fully did. But it was the most honest conversation we had ever had, and that was something. Vanessa took longer. She did not call me. She communicated through Derek for 2 weeks, which I found both predictable and revealing. Derek would relay messages. She was still upset. She was working through her feelings. She felt I had humiliated her in front of her parents. I did not respond to any of this through Derek. I told Derek each time that I was happy to speak with Vanessa directly when she was ready and that I had nothing hostile to say to her. The call finally came on a Tuesday evening in November. She was calmer than I expected. She said she wanted to understand what had happened from my side. I appreciated the phrasing even if it was slightly guarded. I gave her a version of what I had told Derek, shorter and more focused on the specific issue of the cottage and of being consulted. She said she had made assumptions. She said she realized that. She said she thought that since we were family, things did not need to be as formal as all that. I said I agreed that family did not need to be formal, but that family also should not mean that one person's needs and preferences are simply not considered. I said that informality work. When everyone's interests were being taken into account, but when informality started looking like one person making decisions for another person, it stopped being warmth and started being control. There was a long pause. Then she said she had not thought about it that way. I told her I believed her. I told her I did not think she was a bad person. I told her I thought she was very focused on her own family's needs and that she had not fully made room for the idea that I also had needs. She did not argue with this. That in itself told me something had shifted. Her parents found a ground-floor apartment in a building with an elevator 30 minutes from Derek and Vanessa's house. Vanessa sent me a photo of it the week they moved in. It was bright and had a small balcony. Frank and Carol looked comfortable in the picture. I sent back a warm response saying it looked wonderful. I meant it. The cottage stayed mine. And here is what happened to the cottage after all of this. I used it more. I invited Ruth up for a full week that winter and we walked the frozen lake and talked about things we had not talked about in years. I invited 2 of my oldest friends for a long weekend in February. I called my neighbor on the lake, a man named Pat who I had barely spoken to in years despite him being there almost every summer, and we started having dinner together when I was up there. I filled the place with my own life, which is what it had always been meant for. In the spring, I told Derek and Vanessa that they were welcome to use the cottage for 2 weeks each summer, just as they always had been, but that I needed a minimum of 3 weeks' notice, and that the arrangement was not permanent or assumed, but was an ongoing thing that could continue as long as our relationship was healthy. Derek said that was fair. Vanessa did not respond directly, but she also did not object. Sophie came with them that first summer under the new arrangement. She was almost 3 by then, and she loved the water. I taught her to throw a stick into the lake for my dog. I watched her laugh at the splash, and I let myself feel that fully. I did not compress it or set it aside. I just sat in it and let it be what it was. Derek brought me a bottle of wine that week and said he was glad things were better between us. I told him I was glad too. We did not do a big dramatic rehashing of the past. We just started being different. Which is, in the end, all that any reconciliation actually requires. There were a few moments in that week when Vanessa and I were alone together in the kitchen or on the dock, and the air between us was still a little careful. But careful is not hostile. Careful is 2 people who are trying. I can work with careful. What I could not continue working with was invisible. The moment that I keep coming back to, the one that feels like the true ending to this chapter of my life, happened on the last morning of their visit. I woke up very early before anyone else was moving, and I went out to the deck with my coffee. The lake was completely still. There was mist rising off the water. The sky was that particular pale blue that only exists for about 15 minutes just after dawn. My dog was at my feet. I heard the screen door open behind me, and I turned to see Sophie standing there in her pajamas, hair still messy from sleep, holding her little stuffed rabbit. She looked at the lake, and then she looked at me, and she climbed up into the chair beside mine without being invited, the way small children do when they are completely comfortable. She sat there with me in the quiet for maybe 10 minutes. Neither of us said anything. The mist slowly lifted off the water. The blue deepened. Then she said, "Grandpa James, why is the water so still?" I told her the water was still because the whole world was still asleep, and the lake was being quiet so it would not wake anyone up. She thought about this for a moment. Then she nodded very seriously, as though I had said something that made complete sense to her, which to a 3-year-old I suppose it did. I looked at the water and I understood that I had nearly given all of this away. Not because anyone had stolen it from me, but because I had been in the process of handing it over piece by piece without noticing. The cottage was a stand-in for everything I had been allowing to be taken. My time, my space, my voice, my table, my place in the family I had helped build. The locks I had changed that morning in October had not been changed out of anger. They had been changed because I had finally remembered something that should have never been forgotten. This was mine. The water, the quiet, the mist, the chair, the dog at my feet, the small girl asking questions beside me in the early morning, mine to protect, mine to share when I chose to, mine to keep when I needed to. James was back, and he was not going anywhere. The people who had treated him like a resource were learning, slowly and with various degrees of difficulty, that resources run out when they are taken for granted. But relationships, real ones built on genuine respect, tend to last. I was willing to build one of those. I was no longer willing to pretend I already had one when I did not. If I could go back and tell the James of 7 years ago anything, I would not tell him to be harder or colder or more defensive. I would just tell him to pay attention. Pay attention when the ground moves under your feet. Pay attention when the same thing keeps happening in different wrappers. Pay attention when the word overreacting is used to close a conversation that deserved to stay open. And most importantly, pay attention to the documents. Know what you own, know what you signed, know what your name is on, because the people who take from you are often not thieves. They are not evil. They are people who have simply learned that you will absorb whatever they need you to absorb. And the only way to change that is to stop absorbing. Not with a fight, not with a speech, just with a calm, clear, unmovable no.